Hello everyone, I'm Chad Hauer, also known as Kudzu, and today we're going to be talking about IntraWeb 17. I call this the Webolution Begins. Now, a lot of people are going to ask, well, currently we're at IntraWeb 14, so why are we talking about 17? So let's take a quick review of the roadmap, which is fully posted online at the URL. You can see at the bottom of the slide. IntraWeb 15 we're going to skip completely. And the reason for this is we had talked about it for quite a while and it had been in flux, and just to avoid confusion we're just going to skip 15. So the next version will be 16. The primary features of 16 are going to be Linux, native Apache support on both Linux and Windows, and IDE menu integration. So the idea here is that some of the options that are in the standalone server controller will move to the IDE so that you can make the settings before you launch. It'll be backwards compatible. Although Linux may force a few minor changes, we expect that most IntraWeb 14 projects will be able to be imported and run with no or minor changes, except for the package names and the usual types of things that you need to do when changing versions. And the overall goal for 16 is to be enticing, yet timely. For IntraWeb 17 is where we're putting the big bang features. These are going to take a little bit longer, but we've been working on them for quite a while already, and we're making excellent progress on these. The goal for 17 is to be highly backwards compatible. There will be possibly some changes, but we really want to make it so that users can take their existing 14 and by that time 16 projects and bring them straight into 17 and get up and running as fast as possible. Now we're going to be doing this through a thing called dual mode, which means there will be two different types of forms or pages depending on what you call them. There'll be the existing types, page 14 or page 16, and you can import a project and just run it. But there'll be a new form type to take advantage of the new features. And the cool thing is that you can mix and match them in the same application. So you can bring in an existing application and then slowly move pieces over to the new 17 model or not at all. The other features are IWML. This is the main feature we're going to be talking about today. This gives us responsive mobile, desktop, and many more features. We're going to be having WordPress and Facebook integration as well. So these are some of the rather big features we're rather excited about. However, these are not the only features for 17, and there'll be a lot of features that are phased in 17. So what that means is you'll see a 17.0 release, a 17.1, a 17.2, a 17.3, etc., bringing in the major features so that we don't have to complete all of them at once to get to the release. Now, IWML is the biggest feature of all, so this will absolutely be in the 17.0 release. Let's go through a little bit of history, and I want to get to code as soon as possible, but there's a lot of things that we really need to explain, and some of it is explained by history. The beginning, back in 95 or so, when Delphi was still handled by Borland. And I want you to keep in mind that the consumer digital cameras back then were brand new. They had just become available to market, and so excuse the fuzziness of some of these pictures. This is actually in London in 1997. And this is one of the first public demonstrations of IntraWeb at the time. And it may be hard to see, but that little black box on the left is actually a custom-built computer in a suitcase. And at the time, it held 4 parallel CPUs in it. It had 4 Pentiums, and the thing was like a rock. But we had to carry that to demonstrate some of the heavier server loads, because at the time we were running Oracle, etc. And the first versions of IntraWeb, actually for a short time, it's called Portcullis and then Web Solution Builder. A few customers might remember these, but the IntraWeb name came soon after. And there's bonus points to anyone who can identify the 4 people in this picture. They're all well-known Delphi people, and 3 of them are still in the Delphi world. One of them is not in the Delphi world anymore, but is still in the development world, and many people will know him. So let's review exactly where we came from. When IntraWeb first came out, we were dealing with very different ecosystem than we see today. The original version was in Delphi 1.0, in 16-bit actually, but by the time it got public, I think we were at the Delphi 2.0 and Windows 95. And the development tools were very different, but so were the web standards, drastically different. And you can see here in the picture here, that's actually Bob Swart when we first demonstrated IntraWeb to him. And the browsers, and another famous Delphi person there also looking at IntraWeb for the first time. The browsers back then at the time were Netscape, which is a predecessor to Mozilla 3.0, and Internet Explorer 3.0. HTML was pretty basic back then, and the problem is they weren't even compatible 100% between the browsers, because at this point each of the browsers were trying to take over HTML, as you will, to add the custom extensions that they wanted, and so we had to write custom code for each of the browsers. And Believe it or not, this still lingers a little bit today. It's getting a lot better in, say, even the last year or two, but there are still differences between the browsers, although nothing like it used to be. And the internet back then, well, it was mostly dial-up. The average speed was 33.6. That was considered a top speed at the time, and many of our users were still coming through AOL. And just to give you an idea, look at the hardware that David and I is looking at the laptop over there. I mean, it was a black and white screen and very small. So evolution of web development. Now, when the web first came out, this is pretty much what everybody was doing. They were just taking strings, concatenating them, and throwing them at the browser. And you can see that this isn't very maintainable. And this is why there was an influx of tools that came along very quickly around this time period. So IntraWeb 1.0 was originally 95. It was a CGI application. Delphi 1.0, and it was written on Indy because back then plugging anything into a web server was very difficult, and the web servers were very limited. And we had been developing real estate applications for some customers, and we developed IntraWeb around our work to make that quite a bit easier. The other tools at the time, in 94 PHP came out, 95 IntraWeb, but we were not tag based. There was Cold Fusion, HotSite, ASP, which was a predecessor to ASP.NET, and then in the 2000s ASP.NET came along. Now all of them, with the exception of ASP.NET, are tag based, and I've just shown you some example PHP on the side. Now whether the PHP or Cold Fusion, they're all tag based. Generally you're editing in the HTML or at least merging with HTML, and your code ends up being full of quite a bit of HTML, and to develop for the web you have to know HTML. Now that might seem obvious. However, how many Delphi programmers today know assembly? And so what I'm going to show you moving forward is that really HTML and JavaScript we hope to treat as a lower level, and we've always treated them this way as assembly languages to Delphi programmers. Now in the older days of Delphi it was a little bit of a mix. Everybody kind of programmed a little bit of assembly, and that's the way IntraWeb is even today. Many users don't use any HTML at all, but most of the users who want to get deeper in, they end up having to learn HTML and JavaScript. And with IntraWeb 17, we want to take that to the next level. So we're increasing the number of high-level abstractions so that fewer and fewer people need to go down to the JavaScript or HTML level. However, it'll still be fully accessible. Just like Delphi today, you can use inline assembly, but most people don't. We're going to allow that, and especially when it comes to things like styling and integration with existing websites, because it doesn't do any good to create all these high-level abstractions if we can't interop with what's out there now. And most people want to integrate their applications into existing websites or have the graphic designers who are going to want to use CSS, etc. So we're not going to take away any of those capabilities. But the idea is that we want to move the abstraction level up quite a bit higher so that the average IntraWeb user really doesn't care if they're deploying to HTML or something else. They're just going to build this. Now IntraWeb evolved. We had a component-based architecture, and we were ahead of the curve on many things. Long before Ajax, several years before Ajax, we actually had something called partial, which did the same thing Ajax did. Now in the 90s, when you could refresh part of a page without refreshing the whole page, people thought that was magical. And we were early in session management, the higher abstraction levels, things like aligns, anchors, and layouts. Later in the 90s and 2000s, a lot of the app devs, they went to Adobe Flash Player, Java, and Silverlight because of all the restrictions in HTML and just the absolute difficulty of developing with not just JavaScript, because you were forced into JavaScript or throwing tags at things. But all of these are pretty much dead now. The Adobe Flash Player is officially dead, Silverlight's officially dead, and Java is still big on the server, but in the browser it's pretty much dead. Post-2000, we moved on to things like ASP.NET, which is the closest thing there is to IntraWeb, but it's still at a lower level than IntraWeb is and requires a lot more knowledge of the underlyings to make it work. There's JavaScript. Now we have things like React, Angular, etc., and they're getting a lot of attention. But the thing is, if you look at over in the bottom right here, that's some React example. You're still throwing HTML in the middle of your code. And imagine if in your Delphi applications, imagine if, let's say, half or even 1/3 of your code was assembly language. You wouldn't be as productive as you are today if you spent 2/3 of your time in Delphi and 1/3 in assembly language, and it makes debugging really hard as well. So nearly all the existing solutions today are still tag-based. And the elephant in the room, I mean, it's sitting right here that nobody really wants to talk about, is we're still doing tag-based development outside of IntraWeb and, let's say, ASP.NET. So more than 2 decades later, we have some Cold Fusion code here, and then we have the React code. And yeah, they're different, and React is definitely farther along than Cold Fusion. I'm certainly not trying to compare the two at all directly. However, we're still messing with the low-level HTML, or in the Delphi equivalent, assembly language. Meanwhile, sometimes I feel like when I work in the other tools, or I'm working in JavaScript, I feel like this automotive shop in Poland who is still running a Commodore 64 to run a machine. So today, if we were in Delphi, just imagine if this was where we spent 1/3 of our time. And imagine that all Delphi developers had to learn this to even produce most Delphi applications. Certainly we wouldn't be as productive as we are today. Let's talk about IWML. This is by far the single biggest feature of IntraWeb 17, and certainly the focus. Now we have just, this is just a mock-up because we don't have the Delphi portions done yet. And yeah, someone always points out to me, why are you showing Delphi 2009? Well, the reason being is we're a component developer. It would be really great if we could do everything in the latest versions of Delphi, but we have customers using older versions of the IDE, and the easiest way for us to make sure that things don't creep in that don't work in the older versions is to do our testing and even most of our div in the older versions. So some of the screenshots you'll see are in the older versions. Yes, I know about it, thank you. So the idea here is you have an IntraWeb page, and you'll be able to lay it out, drag and drop, just like you will an existing one today, but the layouts will be quite a bit different. You'll have properties. Everything's going to work pretty much the same, but the difference is instead of storing in a DFM, the stream storage for it is going to be stored in what's called IWML. And you can see some sample IWML here. Even without me explaining anything, a lot of this should be self-apparent. And we're going to explain why we didn't use a DFM, why we didn't use some other formats that are available as we move forward. But you can see here, this creates just a simple page, and that it has a stack. Now a stack just stacks things one on top of each other. This one's a vertical stack, so it's going to go top to bottom, but you can go left to right. There are simple stacks, there are grids, there are fixed layouts, and the layouts are completely pluggable, so you can add your own. You could add circular menus. It's completely expandable, and every control responds to these layouts, so you can move a control from one layout to the other, and even tabs can be done as layouts. And IWML stands for the IntraWeb Markup Language. First, don't panic. I alluded to this before, but you're going to have a single application which can support both the existing page types that are in IntraWeb 14 and the coming 16 now, and you can put them side by side. So you can take an existing IntraWeb application which has, it doesn't matter how many, 100 pages, 200 pages, bring them in, and generally, aside from changing the version numbers and a few minor changes, take your existing application and run it in 17 as is. From there, though, since you can mix and match the page types in a single application, you can say, well, there's certain forms that I really want to take advantage of the new features. So you could convert those forms but leave everything else alone. You could add new forms using the new technology, and you could migrate them as desired. So you can really mix and match, and it really lets you take advantage of all the existing code you have without having to make any changes, but still add the new functionality into your application. Now, of course, for new applications, I think people are going to want to choose IWML. So the IWML format it's a subtype of what we call the Acorn format, which is the A to Z compact object readable notation. And it's not XML and it's not JSON. We actually had both of these in use before. The problem with XML is it is horribly chatty. The XML versions of IWML versus the IWML Acorn ones that we use now, they were 3, 4, 5, 6 times as big. And when you're hand editing these, which in the end you won't have to do, but at some point, you know, like the HTML, you're going to want to look at the IWML. And it's a lot easier to read in the Acorn format. The XML was just massive. And then we switched to JSON for a while. And the problem with JSON is it's way too limited in too many areas. It was designed to be very simplistic, and it does a great job at that. When you start to get a little more complex, you have to use workarounds which then make it very chatty as well. And its overuse of shifted characters like the quote, when you're hand editing these things, will send you to the hospital for carpal tunnel syndrome pretty quickly. We still use JSON for the REST calls, and you can still use JSON, that's not a problem. But IWML itself is going to be in the Acorn format. And again, this is hand edited right now, but there will be designers both in Delphi, but we're working on some that are directly in the browser and standalone designers as well. So we have IntraWeb 17 will be truly responsive, and you can see a little bit more of an a little bit more of an IWML sample here. Not just the fixed layout. So IntraWeb right now doesn't really have a sense of layouts other than you drop it here and it goes at this position. Now you can anchor them and you can align them, and that certainly makes it responsive in most desktop scenarios. But when you get to the mobiles, it becomes a little bit trickier on the smaller screens. So most people switch to templates, and that's the only way currently in IntraWeb 14 that you can really do the truly responsive layouts once you leave the desktop. IntraWeb 17 doesn't have the fixed as the core layout anymore. It's there, you can use it, and many people will, especially when building desktop applications. But you don't even have to choose one per page, because you can mix and match, because everything's embedded. So in IntraWeb 17, you could say, I want this section of the screen to be a fixed layout, but I want this section of the screen to flow, and put them inside of each other. And you can even embed controls into text of other controls using Databinding, which we're going to show a little bit later. So you can see, for example, in this IWML example on the right, we have a stack. Okay, now that just stacks them one on top of each other. And then I have the properties for that stack, and then I have the controls. So I have a text, a multi-line edit box, etc. But inside that, and this is inside that stack, I have another. This is a simple stack. It has fewer properties, it's a little more lighter weight, and they're only vertical. And inside that, I have some more. So we have layouts inside of layouts. Now the flow of the data, this is really, really important. And if you don't take home anything else about why IWML is important, this is the slide I really, really want you to focus on, because this is the biggest benefit of IWML that's easy to explain as well. In IntraWeb 14 and 16, the designer saves everything into the Delphi DFM file. And then at runtime, the server will convert that DFM into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and it has to send all of these down to the browser. And it works really, really well. However, it certainly makes our internal code a lot more complex than we would like. It makes it much more difficult to develop controls, for example. It makes it much harder to debug, because you're basically compiling a language and then you're throwing it into the browser for the browser to interpret it, and you have these two disconnects. And even if you use debuggers, etc., it's still, you're having to do a lot of mental translations between things to figure out what's going on. And that's really one of the beauties of IntraWeb, and where we handle a lot of the stuff for the users. It isn't just the translation, but the session, the cookies, and all those sorts. But IntraWeb 17 drastically simplifies component authoring. It makes things a lot easier to develop, debug, and move forward. So it makes it a lot easier on us to develop controls, but also third parties and end users. So what happens in IntraWeb 17 with IWML is that the designer will translate it to IWML. And then what happens is, instead of translating it on the server into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, it sends the IWML directly to the browser. And then the IntraWeb code that we've written that runs in the browser, the IWCL, which has always existed, but this is a much expanded version of it, it will take that IWML inside the browser, and inside the browser it will translate it to HTML, CSS, and TypeScript. Now this might not seem like a big deal, but in addition to the simplification, it gives us several other big advantages, which we're going to talk about soon. IWML is not backwards compatible. It will require new controls and new pages. And the IWCL, as I discussed briefly, is the browser DOM or VCL area. So you might think of IWML as a true VCL for the web, or if you've worked in .NET, a WPF or XAML. So WPF users will understand this concept a little bit quicker, because they're used to using the designer, but sometimes switching over to the XAML to edit things. Delphi users don't really do that much with the DFMs. It does happen, but it's pretty rare. They typically use the designer for everything. Now HTML is kind of the way. Sometimes you edit things in a WYSIWYG editor, and you switch back and forth to HTML, and you go back and forth between the two. And that's the way IWML and the forms are as well. You can switch back and forth, be able to edit IWML, and then switch back to the designer. What you see is what you get designer, and it'll reflect all the changes you've made in IWML. This really helps for cutting and pasting and a lot of different things, but it'll be two-way. So if you don't want to edit the IWML by hand, that's fine. Everything will be available in the designer. You can still drag and drop, including all the layouts, and do everything visually. And that's what we hope most people do. But at times, it does make sense to switch over and edit the source code. The DFM is essentially replaced by an IWML file. However, in the first releases, to make it a little bit easier, We may store it locally in the DFM and convert it to IWML on the fly before sending it to the browser, but the end goal is to store it directly in IWML. IWML is more domain specific and it's more portable. Now you say portable for which? Well, there's several aspects this could really think about, but right now we're only targeting the browser, but IWML itself is decoupled from HTML. Now you can send down raw HTML to bypass things if you don't want to write components, but in most cases it's decoupled. Its design is independent of it. So there are future longer term plans to make custom renderers for IWML for smaller devices, embedded devices, and those sorts of things. Because in today's development world, all the phones can render HTML just fine, even the advanced stuff. But if you're working in the embedded world, it's quite a big deal to get a modern browser into an embedded device. But if you want to have graphics, you're left with a lot of base technologies or just very simplistic graphics. With a base IWML and cross-platform projects and these embedded projects will have the ability to render IWML. So if you're running on a Raspberry Pi and you don't want to have to load up a whole web browser, which is very CPU intensive and a lot of code intensive, memory intensive, you'll be able to render IWML very simply. And then we're also looking at, for instance, I'm involved in another project called Cosmos, which is a C# open source managed operating system, making IWML one of its render types as well. So it has a low memory and graphics option and be able to handle this remotely as well. So not just directly on one thing, but be able to pass this IWML from client to server. So remote desktop type scenarios as well that are easier for the server, which may be an embedded device, to be able to generate IWML. Now render in the browser. So as we discussed briefly before, the HTML and the CSS is no longer sent from the server down to the browser. Instead, it sends the IWML. This greatly simplifies the code in the server. And when I say greatly, this really doesn't do it justice. It really drastically simplifies it by many, many, many factors. We do direct DOM emulation versus HTML CSS construction as well. Although technically, if you wanted to write a component and just patch together, cut and pasted HTML, you could, but we use a DOM manipulation method and we have our own custom libraries. Now you can integrate jQuery and Bootstrap and all those other things if you really want to write stuff into the browser as well. But the IWML libraries itself and IWCL doesn't do it. It's all based on our own code. Now the server, there are some huge advantages. First of all, the server CPU load is significantly reduced because it's not spending so much bandwidth constructing strings and putting these strings together and throwing them back and forth, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it actually consumes a fair bit of the CPU during the render cycle of IntraWeb. And when you're hitting an IntraWeb application with thousands or tens of thousands or even more users, you're spending a lot of time just throwing these strings and concatenating them back and forth. By removing that, it takes that code and drops it down to pretty much zero because all it has to do is throw an IWML file down. Also the same thing to RAM. So you can get more sessions with less RAM. And the bandwidth, because when you send down, it's like the difference between sending down, say, Delphi source code to someone. Let's say you want to transfer something to someone and they're on a slow connection. The Delphi source code is usually a lot smaller than the executable output in most cases. And you can think of it the same way. Before, IntraWeb was throwing down the executable versions of an IntraWeb application, albeit they were in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But now we're sending down the source code, the IWML. And since the browser then constructs it, the amount of bandwidth required is significantly lessened as well. And the testing is drastically easier. The components we've already built in IntraWeb 17 are so much easier to develop because we can do it in a way doing it external to the server as well. It also makes unit testing a lot easier because now we can take the components and they can be completely isolated for testing, developing, and debugging. So we use TypeScript instead of JavaScript. And let's just talk about what TypeScript is really quick. First of all, JavaScript is the Vogue on poetry of code. I know it's all the rage with a lot of newer programmers, but it has no type safety. The laundry list of items on this language would be huge, especially coming from anyone who likes Delphi. Visual Basic makes JavaScript look like, JavaScript makes Visual Basic look like the world's perfect language. TypeScript comes from Anders Hausberg, who everybody should know who that is, as he is the father of Delphi and .NET, many say, and it's his answer to JavaScript. Now what happens with TypeScript is it's a superset of JavaScript, so basically you can think of it as JavaScript done right, or a lot of people call it JavaScript for Delphi or C# developers. That's a little closer to C# than Delphi, but that's mostly because JavaScript comes out of a Java syntax, and C# and C, Java, etc. They all have a closer syntax to each other than Delphi would. It's a superset, however, and what happens is TypeScript compiles into JavaScript. So there's no funky interpreters here, there's no funky things here. It compiles to JavaScript, and when you deploy, you don't actually deploy TypeScript, you deploy JavaScript, which came from the TypeScript, and it's all done in a transparent method. So where's Delphi in this equation? Well, in this demo, we're not going to see it quite yet. And the reason being is, in the end, you're going to be able to build web apps in IntraWeb 17, just like you do 14. You'll be able to write everything in Delphi without ever having to touch TypeScript or IWML or HTML or CSS or JavaScript if you don't want to. Now, if you want to run in the browser, you'll need to learn a little bit of TypeScript. But that's as it is today, you would have to learn JavaScript, so we're even making even that step easier. But we have to build the base first. And as I said, the advantage of IWML is that everything is completely isolated. So we're working on that base right now, and in parallel, we're developing IntraWeb 16 and 17. So there's one team on 16 and one team on 17. And as 16 gets a little bit farther along, when 17 is ready, we will hook the IWML onto the back of 16. And this is actually the easiest part, because what we have to do is basically, for this page, for the IWML pages, we skip a lot of code for rendering, and we just send the instructions down to IWML. So in the IntraWeb 17 development roadmap, the Delphi side of what we're doing is probably maybe somewhere between 15 and 20% of the work. So we just aren't there yet. And that's why I'm not going to show you anything in Delphi yet today, but I'm going to show you how IWML works and some simplified applications and what it can do. So let's move on to the demos. And what I'm going to switch to here is, this is Visual Studio Code. It is a free IDE for Microsoft. It's not the same as a Visual Studio. It looks nothing like Visual Studio. It's much more simplified and it has an open ecosystem. And the reason I'm using this is it's the easiest way to develop TypeScript, and that's where I'm at this point, is I'm still developing in TypeScript. So of course, since Delphi doesn't support TypeScript, it makes sense that I'm not in Delphi right now. But also, the only people who would need to work in Visual Studio Code would be people who want to write TypeScript themselves, which you could even do in Notepad if you want to, but then you lose all the ability to do debugging and watches and all the really useful stuff. I mean, you can use the JavaScript debuggers in the browsers, but it's not the same level of experience. So if you want to develop TypeScript, I strongly recommend Visual Studio Code. You can also use full Visual Studio as well. But the problem I've noticed there is that Visual Studio, it's so big and so heavy, and most of the stuff in there doesn't apply to TypeScript. And I felt like it kind of got in my way when I was working with TypeScript. And not only that, but as new TypeScript versions are released, they have to upgrade the tooling. And Visual Studio proper often lags behind by weeks or sometimes months, preventing you from using newer versions of TypeScript. Whereas the Visual Studio Code releases follow almost immediately. So that's why we're doing everything in here. So let's take a quick look. And what I have here is I have everything set up, and I have it set up for the different browsers, Chrome, Edge, and Firefox. And this is the launch URL that Visual Studio Code will use. Now we could launch everything completely without Visual Studio Code. In fact, right now, to do alpha tests in IntraWeb 17, all you need to do is have a web browser, because everything happens in the web browser, plus a web server to serve up the files. It can't be done locally off just the file system because of permissions issues with HTML in the browsers. But you can set up any web server, and all the content and all the libraries are handled in the browser right now. So I could easily run these just by cutting and pasting into our URL in Chrome, but I'm going to run it in here so we can show you the debugging in different aspects. So the first thing I want to show you is just a simple application called Fiddler. And so I'm just going to press F5 and it'll launch Chrome. Now you see here it says loading IntraWeb, and that took a short time. It's actually 500 milliseconds. Now normally you won't see that at all. What happened there is when I'm debugging, the JavaScript debuggers, they're not available immediately. So what happens is if you try and debug any code during the rendering, it doesn't hit any of your breakpoints or do any of your watches. So we have a option in the code, and what it does is if it knows you're debugging, it waits 500 milliseconds before rendering the page so that it can attach the debugger. So various times when I'm clicking on things, when you see loading IntraWeb, it's not that IntraWeb is slow, it's that it's waiting on the debugger. And of course, when you deploy it, you completely disable that. So for now, what we're going to do is we're going to go in, and we're going to go to Fiddler, and I'm just going to open this in a new tab for now. So here's Fiddler, and what Fiddler lets me do is I can just type in HTML, and then it'll show me what it looks like when I render it. And this is very useful, of course, for testing out IWML. Now, this is going to be fully expanded to the point that eventually it'll have drag and drop capabilities. It'll show you the properties using what Delphi users would call reflection to know which properties that the different components you have a component palette, those sorts of things. But right now it's fairly basic. So here's the basic IWML. I have the acorn header, the page, the root. I'm just going to use a simple stack, and I just have a single button. And if I just say render IWML, you can see I have it over here. Now render the button in this area. And if I want to render more buttons, I can come, and I need to give them unique names, but let's make 2 buttons. Okay, and now we have 2 buttons, and they just stack on top of each other because it's a simple stack. And if I want spaces, I can do things, for example, and that'll put an empty space, and I can render that again. We're also working on things like hotkeys so that you'll be able to use hotkeys like a desktop application. And for instance, right now it has some very basic error handling. So if you try and render this, it'll tell you control not loaded or can't be found, BTTON, because it's not just a thing. It tells you line number 6. But we're working on the fact that it'll come over and it'll highlight these type things. And you can also do, for instance, we have some predefined, and there's a lot more than this, but right now these are the few I have in here. And so I have, for instance, let's take, this is one of our stress tests. It's a monster IWML file, which uses various syntaxes and various controls. It doesn't do everything, but it loads a lot of stuff, and we use it just to see if we've broken anything. And you notice when I went to here, it loaded another form, but you didn't notice it reload any HTML because it's loading it in place. So now I can render this, and these green debug borders, these are debug borders. You see right here, it says debug borders at control. And there are certain debug options you can turn on. So if you have problems with spacing, you're wondering why things are laying out the way they are, you can turn on the debug order by doing that. And you can see I have, even simple things like HTML lists are represented. And if I come over here, that's the list right here. And you can see the styles are set and so forth. So if I want to come up, and I can turn debug borders off. There, and now you can see how it looked to an end user. And these are just basic layouts that are available with that. So let's take a look at a simple actual application. Okay, so let's run it first. This is, well, the standard guest application has been around in IntraWeb since, the mid-1990s. And this one, again, is written just in TypeScript, and it's very simple, and it doesn't have any advanced layouts. It doesn't look fancy. We'll talk about styling in a little bit. But I can just put in numbers, and I can execute them. Now, the average IntraWeb user is going to look at this application and going to think, yeah, this is a really simple Fiddler application, even in Delphi. Yes, it is, but I want you to think about this application if you were to write it using a tool other than IntraWeb. You were going to write it using React or Angular or any of those. Yes, it's possible, and yes, it's a very simple application, but the point is you would still be mucking about in the HTML. Clearly, you wouldn't be working at the app level or component level. So let's take a look at this guest application and what's involved in it. So in the guest application, we have 4 files. Now this file is just a shell. You can see it's an HTML file, and it's just an empty HTML file. It has the text loading into what we see, and the only special thing in here is this reference to this JS file. And this JS file is what loads IntraWeb and goes from there. So index.html will look for an index IWML file. So we have the IWML file, which has our edit box, our text box, and then the text block, which shows the guest counts, and our button. And we also have action control and focus control. What this does is it says when the page renders, we want you to put the focus on edit guess, and if the user hits enter anywhere, we want you to press button guess. So again, these are things that if you did in HTML, most of these things you would have to code by hand. And it looks very simple, but it's not as simple as you would think. And when you get to the higher things, like we're putting in something that would be closely, the closest Delphi concept I can think of would be the action list, which I know not many people use. But you'll be able to set up, or WPF people like routed commands. You'll be able to set up commands, and IntraWeb will handle all the routing, the enabling, the disabling of the controls, the hotkeys, and so forth. And then we have a generated file. This basically is generated for you automatically, and it generates references to the individual controls in your code. Now here's the actual user code. Now in this case it's TypeScript. Again, you'll be able to fully do this in Delphi in the future, but right now it's still TypeScript. But everyone should be able to recognize it. So I have the hard, right now I just had it hard coded to 5. And then just like on Delphi now, I just create a click event. And you'd notice that there's no HTML here. It's still running in the browser, but I'm working with all the components at a component level. So for instance, the edit guess, I don't have to set the HTML, I set the text property. And it's the same way to read it. I just read things in, so I read the text value. And then I can set the text message, and same thing here. Now that's a single event application, but I think you get the idea how different that even at the TypeScript level and the JavaScript level, how different IntraWeb is from React or Angular or anything else that's really currently out there now. So we can also do data binding. So for instance, let's come back. Okay, close the browser. Let's run the browser again. And let's go to data binding. Now this is really simplistic just to show you how it works. But for instance, you can see here we have name and the name Leanne Graham 3 times. Now why is it here 3 times? I'm going to show you in the IWML because it's 3 different syntaxes to be able to do things. So let's come over here, let's put these side by side so that you can leave that one open. Let's close these out. Now that one came from right here. Now you don't have to have HTML files for every IWML. You only need them if you want to launch them directly. So that one I came through a separate link. So what I have here is I have my IWML, but I have a set of data sets, and in this case I only have one. So I have a data set called DS users, and I'm pointing it at this URL. This URL is a publicly accessible sample server which serves REST data. So you can plug in any REST server you want here. You could use the features that are available in Delphi. You could use the Embarcadero server that supplies REST. You can use KBMW. You can use anything that serves REST. It could be C#, Java. It doesn't matter. The point is we don't care. You can still data bind the old way where you bind on the server and it sends down the values as we do in Delphi now, or you can change over to REST, or you can mix and match the two of them. So in the IWML, it's a simple stack where I have several controls on top of each other. So in this one, you can see I have the text property, and I set it equals to dsusers.name. Okay? And if I load this, let's take a look what this REST call looks like. We can bring it over into the browser. Oh, I had extra. Sorry. Okay, so that's the REST call. And it returns these objects. So you can see we're accessing. So if we want to change it to username, we could change one of these. We could change this one to username. Okay? And then all I can do is come over. Let's restart the app to get the new. And then we go to data, and see now we have Brett, because that's the username that was returned by the REST call. Now, what's really cool is there are several different syntax. So the reason the equal syntax occurs is if you need to bind numeric properties. You could bind colors, you could bind layouts, you can bind all kinds of things. And then we also have the longer text one. This is part of IntraWeb Markdown, which you can use for bold, italics, and you can plug it as well. You put it in square brackets and say data, and you can even embed the tags. So for in this case, you can get bold of username, because even this name here is part of the value, because text is a property, and even though there's a colon, the whole output is actually name something. So we could even change this to, to make it a little more clear on people. Say, your name is, and you can see this means bold, and this means retriever from the data. And this time when we go in, you'll see your name is, because we changed it right here. So it's embedded text. And you can do this other properties too. The data binding is really quite expansive. And of course there's record navigation. So you can navigate, you can send down a series of records, just like when we looked at this REST here. Let's look at this again. There are actually quite a few records in here, not just one. So directly in the browser, you can navigate through these without having to go back to the server every time. Oh, sorry, I wanted to show you. I was going to show you the rest. So here's the rest. So you can navigate to user 2 or user 3, etc., by changing the pointer within the data set within IWML. And you're able to do lookups and these sorts of things. So what this does is it makes your application super, super responsive. They absolutely fly because it's not making as many calls back to the server. Now, I was actually worried about running short on time or running long, so we're going to have to speed up a few things here. Styling, people are asking, will I have CSS? Yes, you'll be able to do styling similar to how you do styling now in IntraWeb at the HTML level. You'll be able to do templates in a similar fashion as you do at the HTML level in Delphi now, where you can embed individual controls in individual spots, or you can render a whole IntraWeb page into a region. For example, let's go over to Test App, and I just took a page off our website and click on it, see, and what it did was it rendered that same data binding, but it put it inside of another HTML page, which was taken from our website, including all the styling, etc. So even today, you can do simple things like this. And this could be fully interactive. There could be buttons. There could be whatever you want here. It doesn't have to be read-only. And then let's take a quick look at sample controls. Really tight on time. But OK, let's run it. And you're not going to see much right away, but I'll put them side by side again. OK, so let's run, and let's go to sample controls. Now this is probably the most simplistic control I could come up with. Of course, sample controls are not limited to this simplistic behavior, but I wanted to get to the very basics. So for instance, it's called a sample control smiley, and that sample control, first of all, let's look at the IWML, it loads it. So we have, it says text, sample control, it's right there, and then there's several different formats. There's shortcuts and parameters, etc. So we have the sample control with no parameters, smiley with a parameter, or smiley the long form. And you can see over here, they're happy, happy, sad. And where this comes from, the sample control itself, is that's all the code it is for there. So we just extend from IntraWeb control. There's also focus controls and input controls. And then we set up our properties. We initialize it using the DOM. And then in this case, we alter the HTML on the render, and then we have set param. Set param isn't required, but it lets you use a second syntax when you don't have a lot of properties. You can parse them out, and that set param allows this particular syntax like this. Otherwise, you have to use a long syntax for everything. So that's a very simple control, and you can see how simplified the code is and why it's going to make our life so much easier, and why we're going to have so many more controls in IntraWeb 17. The number of controls in IntraWeb 17 is truly going to blow up in count. Okay, so that was the demos. Let's talk about some other features really quick. Components, we're going to port all the existing IntraWeb components. So if you want to move from page 16, 14 over to the IntraWeb 17, all the corresponding components are going to be there. So you're going to have grids, edits, list boxes, and charts, and all that kind of stuff. We're also directly integrating jQuery UI, Bootstrap, Yum, Google Polymer, XJS, and many more. And again, the reason being is they're so much easier to develop. And we're working with our third parties, and we expect we'll see many more third parties on board because it's so much easier to develop controls with IWML. Now, dialogues. Let me show you these real quick. Right now, they're not really fancy, but JavaScript doesn't have threads, and so it makes a lot of things, especially modal type things, really difficult. But we can do dialogues. Sorry, it's already running. Okay, let's close this. Launch it again. Okay, so for instance, we have dialogues. So these are some of the dialogues we have now, but this isn't everything. So for instance, we want a yes, no. Let's say we want an input box. You can see all this gets disabled. Now the funny thing is, everybody says, well, React Angular and they're going to, yeah, but they don't disable the controls behind for you. And even if you go on major apps like Facebook, if you start pressing the tab key or start clicking around, you can start messing with things and crash the pages. So this has all been disabled for you. Even if you try and tab, it just won't go around to it for you, because IntraWeb, it takes care of all these little details for you. So I can say what's for dinner, and I can say, well, I don't want sushi tonight, I want pizza. And I'm just going to press enter. And so you want pizza for dinner. Now that doesn't look that advanced, and it wasn't that flashy, but again, as with many things in IntraWeb, the secret is in the code, how easy the code is. So let's look at test app, and that was dialogues. So you can see, here's the code. It's not quite modal, but it flows through the code as if it's modal by putting the return code right in here. You don't have to worry about having multiple events just to handle simple things like dialogues. And we're going to make the dialogues much prettier, of course. Those are just the base ones. And they're fully stylable and fully pluggable, so you can replace them as well. Okay, let's make the home stretch here. We're going to have a unified library, so one library type to rule them all. So right now you have to switch between, say, IIS and standalone. We're working on a unified library to make one library type, and then it'll have proxies which load them. ASP.NET for IntraWeb already has this ability, and we're going to be explaining these to ISAPI, Apache, and standalone, so it'll make it easier to deploy. A server manager, we've been planning this for many years. Actually, even IWML goes back about 10 years. It's just been a matter of the tooling to get here, because to do this in JavaScript was just horrid, and now with TypeScript it makes it a lot easier. With the server manager, you have the ability to monitor apps, the status, who's online, offline, which apps are online, offline, put applications into maintenance mode, check RAM disk bandwidth, as well as custom information from your application that you may wish to feed out. User stats, how long people have been on the ability to boot users, message users indirectly, and perform stage live upgrades. So you can say, here's an upgrade to this application. I want you to upgrade when everybody logs out, or I want you to upgrade at midnight tonight, or I want the old users to run, the users who are online now to run the old version, but all the new users get the new instance, and when the old users log out and they come back in, look at the new instance, and when the old one has no user left, automatically delete it. So this will make people's lives a whole lot easier. The modal code within the Delphi, we were looking at using fibers in the past, but there's some issues around that. So we're looking at, we may use stalled threads instead. It could impact performance, but it certainly would make the code a lot easier in some cases. WordPress integration, this is going to be a big feature as well. The features are not 100% firmed, but the idea is you'll be able to take IWML and directly put it into WordPress, have user integration, and the merging of WordPress and IntraWeb output like I showed you with our website earlier, which is actually on WordPress as well. So this is a big expansion which really should give IWML and your IntraWeb applications a lot bigger audience to be able to deploy to. And then Facebook integration as well. We're looking at user integration, the ability to post on walls, and develop an actual Facebook integration. So between these two features, this should really give you a much larger audience. IDE support. This is as of February 2017. These are of actual IntraWeb users, so we're completely undecided. Right now we support 2009 and forward. It'd make it a lot easier on us if we don't have to support such old IDEs. So we have not made any decision yet. We'll rerun the data at the time, but if it were today, if we're making this decision today based on these numbers as they were current, I mean, XE2 forward would get us 99% of users, and XE5 would get us 96% of users. So if you're in one of those older IDEs, comment and let us know. We really need to know if there are users that still need support for those older IDEs, because they really do create a lot of extra maintenance. Now, not so much in the building and so forth. We have that down, but the problem is tech support. We get bugs all the time that are IDE or VCL version specific, and it takes a lot of time to keep all of these IDEs up and running and test individual features. The future, Delphi is obviously our flagship. That is our absolute focus. I don't want anybody to be confused about that. But anybody who's done non-Delphi web development can understand that what we're building here could easily be used standalone, as I'm already showing. So we are, always checking the Lazarus community. That's still on the possibility list. Some sort of standalone abilities within WordPress or without. JavaScript, TypeScript by themselves, .NET, Python, PHP. It really opens the world to us. And from a Delphi standpoint, it really helps Delphi a lot too, because face it, PHP and these other languages are out there. And we get requests from users all the time that, hey, there's this PHP app I need to integrate with, and it's kind of difficult right now. You have to pass stuff back and forth with REST, and especially at the UI level, it gets really complicated. So if IWML could run with PHP, then this makes your job a lot easier to hook to your Delphi code. And of course, because now that there's REST abilities within IWML, we'll be building in, at least at the minimum, basic REST capabilities within IntraWeb as well. So you won't need to use something else for basic REST capabilities, but of course you'll be able to use any REST server you want. We're not doing anything to tie you to IntraWeb. Closing, the best place to find information about IntraWeb 17 is on Facebook, and I realize a lot of corporate users can't access it. We do blog as well, but we put several posts a day directly onto what we call IntraWeb 17 Dev Chatter. And it's just random bits of information, but feel free to ask away. We're throwing stuff out there and seeing what people have questions on. ETA, 2018, we'll see betas sometime earlier in the year as well as a release. 2017, we have limited alphas out to our internal Team Z and some closer partners. If you're really interested in testing out at this early phase, you can go ahead and contact us. I can't guarantee we'll be able to include you in that, but if you're really into this low-level stuff, then give us a contact and we'll see what we can do. We'll be putting on online demos fairly soon, and docs. Yeah, we're actually documenting first this time. It sounds like an obvious thing, but we're documenting stuff as we go. There are some limited IW17 documentation online, and we're going to be expanding the documentation to all the components as we expand Fiddler, etc. And some of the things we're going to be expanding on our website are going to be used in IntraWeb 17, probably small surveys, and as we especially get the WordPress integration, we'll be putting it in there, and that should really, really help us out a lot to fill a lot of the gaps that we've found in WordPress. And that's the end. I want to thank you, and if you have any questions, you can reach us on the web at www.a2z.com. Thank you.